What if the oldest empire in human history wasn't lost, since it's still buried under every ancient city we've excavated so far? This is not mere speculation. It's a pattern that's been documented on 4 continents. From Mesopotamia's plains to the Indus Valley, from Anatolia to the Americas, teams of archaeologists have revealed the same disturbing truth. Under the oldest civilizations we know lie the bases of something even older, something designed, something that shouldn't be there based on all models of human progress. We mean precise stone masonry below Sumerian temples, huge structural bases beneath settlements from 8000 BC, whole submerged cities along coastlines that were dry land only in the last ice age. These are not separate enigmas. They create a pattern that methodically breaks down the timeline taught in schools, the one setting civilization's birth securely at 6,000 years ago. The proof isn't concealed. It has been gathering in reports from excavations, surveys in geology, and archaeology underwater for many years.
But ETS implication are so extreme that many historians prefer to village find outly instead of seeing the collective pattern. These discoveries don't merely extend civilizations that backward. They indicate that what we term histories start could really be a reboot. A reconstruction following burial, flooding, and oblivion. If you like delving into the fringe of established history, press that like button and join the channel by subscribing. Share in the comments your location and the current time there. As usual in our video, visuals serve to enhance the mood, but they are not essential for understanding the narrative. Get ready. Let's plunge below the surface. Let's start.
In 1922, amid the sun-baked ruins of southern Mesopotamia, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was digging into the ancient Sumerian city of when his crew discovered something that would subtly trouble archaeology for the century to come. Under the royal tombs, beneath the temples, below all they anticipated as the city's base, they encountered another stratum, an earlier habitation level, divided from the upper city by meters of pure, water-laid clay, a flood deposit. When Woolley first penetrated this lower level, he anticipated untouched earth, the origin point. Instead, he uncovered ceramics, implements, and structural foundations. Civilization didn't commence at the top. It had been interred and constructed upon. The design of these items was distinct, more ancient, in certain aspects more polished than what followed. This wasn't the creation of basic folk gradually developing culture. This was structured society, simply deeper down. Woolley named it the flood layer, and at first thought he'd discovered proof of the biblical flood. The scholarly community swiftly rejected this view, opting to interpret it as a regional river overflow. But Woolley had revealed something more alarming than validation of an ancient tale. He'd uncovered signs of a pattern because wasn't alone. In the 1930s, digs at Eridu, the most ancient city in Sumerian lore, showed the identical setup. Temples constructed atop temples descending through 18 separate habitation levels, each stratum older and more peculiar than the one overhead. The lowest levels displayed advanced layout and grand architecture from 7000 BC. This preceded script, before the wheel, prior to bronze. Yet individuals had planned a city layout, elevated temple bases, and coordinated work on a magnitude implying central control. The identical pattern surfaced at Jericho, at Çatalhöyük, at locations throughout the ancient Near East.
Wherever archaeologists probed sufficiently deep, they encountered the same inconsistency. Below the civilization we identify les something we don't. The response from conventional archaeology was expected. These initial layers were labeled a proto-civilization. Transitional group fumbling toward intricacy. The refinement was minimized. The design was deemed incidental. The pattern was regarded as chance. But then came Göbekli Tepe.
In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt started excavating a hill in southeastern Turkey. What he revealed redefined the permissible boundaries of prehistory. Enormous stone columns set in exact rings, detailed engravings of creatures and icons, celestial alignments, and a radiocarbon age that appeared unbelievable. 9600 BC. This was 11,600 years in the past, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years prior to the pyramids, and 5,000 years before agriculture's invention. Based on all models of human advancement, this shouldn't be possible. Grand architecture demands excess food. Excess food needs farming. Farming generates communities. Communities yield civilization. Göbekli Tepe inverted the order. It demonstrated monumental sacred architecture constructed by folks who hadn't yet mastered farming. The temple preceded everything. Schmidt's group discovered no signs of residential buildings at the location. No dwellings, no storage silos, just the megaliths. This wasn't a town. It was a gathering spot. People journeyed to this site, transported stones up to 20 tons heavy, sculpted them with implements that shouldn't have been advanced enough, and positioned them in flawlessly geometric circles, all before they figured out planting seeds. The ramifications were astonishing. If intricate social structure, star knowledge, and emblematic reasoning existed 11,600 years ago, then what else was present that we haven't uncovered yet? The response could be submerged. During the final ice age, ending about 11,700 years ago, ocean levels sat 120 meters below today's. Expansive coastal flatlands, now seafloor, were arid terrain, and that's where early human groups would have logically assembled. Rivers, sea resources, temperate weather, the prime territory for initial civilizations. When the ice melted, those shores submerged. If advanced societies thrived along those old coasts, they're now under hundreds of feet of water, uncharted and unexplored. In 1985, underwater archaeologists found immersed structures off Dwarka's coast in India. Stone pieces, building bases, items dated to 7,500 BC. The site aligns with accounts in ancient Indian writings of a flooded city, accounts that historians always presumed were legendary. Off Japan's coast, the Yonaguni Formation displays geometric steps, right angles, and marks from tools. Elements that some scholars contend are too uniform to be natural. Conventional geology rejects it as weathering, but the discussion itself highlights something key. We lack a thorough mapping of the sea bottoms where early civilizations would probably have grown. The Gulf of Cambay, the Sunda Shelf, the Persian Gulf area. These were all land during the Ice Age. Now they're underwater. How many towns rest beneath those seas? This poses an uneasy possibility. The civilizations we examine, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, might not represent the first. They could be what endured the inundation, what relocated inland, what succeeded in retaining pieces of wisdom from a prior era. And there's an odd bit of proof that backs this notion. Almost every ancient society recalls a flood. The Sumerians depicted Utnapishtim enduring a godly deluge that ruined the world. The biblical tale keeps Noah. Hindu writings narrate Manu's endurance of a world-destroying flood. Greek lore mentions Deucalion. Chinese myths include Gun and the Great Flood, and flood accounts emerge separately across the Americas, Africa, and Oceania. The usual explanation is that all societies face local floods and turn them into myths. But the framework of these narratives is remarkably alike. Godly alert, devastating ruin, chosen survivors, civilization's renewal. The endurance of the story across disconnected societies poses a query that archaeology has hesitated to tackle. What if these aren't legends? What if they're recollections? The close of the last ice age wasn't a mild thaw. Geological proof indicates catastrophic flood incidents as ice barriers ruptured and glacial lakes emptied. The Younger Dryas era, an abrupt reversion to Ice Age states lasting 1,300 years, concluded suddenly around 9,600 BC with swift warming and sharp sea level increase. This is exactly when Göbekli Tepe was constructed, precisely when shore populations would have been uprooted, precisely when survivors would have shifted inland, bearing whatever wisdom they could safeguard. The schedule matches. The geology endorses it. The mythology recalls it. But if a prior civilization was real and was demolished, what happened to its wisdom? The response could reside in what follows. In the abrupt emergence of sophisticated ideas across early civilizations without evident growth phases, mathematics, astronomy, holy geometry, these concepts appear completely developed in locations that allegedly devise them separately, unless they didn't devise them, unless they received them. And that reception might clarify the most enduring enigma of all. Why the most ancient cities in documented history were erected right atop something more ancient. Not because old people arbitrarily selected the same spots, but because those spots were already holy, already recalled, already designated as important by a world that preceded. The bases under our feet aren't civilization's start. They might be its second effort. To grasp what these interred bases signify, we must scrutinize the archaeological evidence more intently, not site by site, but as a pattern. Because when you chart where these oddities surface, when you follow the habitation layers below known history, something extraordinary appears. A world under our world, older, stranger, and ever harder to overlook. The pattern recurs with alarming regularity. You excavate under an ancient city, anticipating bedrock, untouched soil, the natural earth where history commenced. Instead, you discover another level, then another, then yet another below that. Each stratum divided by flood residue or fire remnants, or merely the gathered dust of ages, but each stratum displaying marks of human coordination, design, building, purposeful arrangement. This isn't how history should function. The conventional model instructs that civilization ascended gradually from dispersed hunter-gatherer groups who slowly uncovered agriculture, which permitted settlement, which yielded surplus, which formed social order, which constructed cities. A consistent ascent over thousands of years. A rational order with distinct phases. But the cities themselves narrate a different tale. Take Jericho. Not the biblical town, but the archaeological location beneath it. Digs starting in the 1950s uncovered over 20 separate habitation layers, reaching back to 9,400 BC. The deepest strata revealed a huge stone tower 10 meters high, built from blocks each weighing hundreds of kilograms. This wasn't a defensive watchtower. There were no foes yet, no conflict, no rival communities. Archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon, who directed the excavation, discovered that the tower had been intentionally packed and buried by subsequent dwellers who then built directly above it. The edifice was safeguarded, not ruined, entombed deliberately as if the soil itself was sacred and couldn't be forsaken. The same intentional stacking shows up at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia. The settlement covers 9,000 years of unbroken occupation. But residents didn't spread outward as numbers increased. They built upward, completely filling old homes, flattening them, and erecting new residences right on top. Generation upon generation, century upon century, remaining exactly within the initial borders. Why? The standard explanation is practical ease. But ease doesn't account for why they would expend effort to maintain the precise outline of a settlement for 9 millennia. It implies something different, that the spot itself possessed meaning beyond simple location. And then there's what was uncovered in the bottommost levels. At Çatalhöyük's base, archaeologists found ornate wall artworks, advanced fabrics, and obsidian mirrors buffed to shine like glass. These items date to 7,400 BC. They don't display the rough efforts of early trialists. They exhibit expertise, methods that surface fully matured without prior stages of experimentation and mistake. The same pattern arises across Mesopotamia. At Tel Halaf in Syria, diggers found a structure named the Eye Temple from 6000 BC. It held thousands of small alabaster statuettes, each etched with unique eye designs. The consistency of creation indicates specialized artisan shops, labor division, economic intricacy, all this 3,000 years before the Sumerian civilization that supposedly originated these ideas. Here's what renders this alarming. These refined early strata don't progress upward into higher refinement. Often the order inverts. The most ancient levels display superior design and building. Then there's a rupture, typically a destruction or desertion layer. Then reconstruction starts anew, but simpler, rougher, as if wisdom had been misplaced and people were relearning to reconstruct from recollection. At Eridu, the 18 temple strata display this precise advancement. The deepest shrine exhibits exact architectural ratios and sophisticated drainage setups. Ascending through time, the temples grow larger but less polished. The math grows less strict, the engineering more ordinary. It's the pattern you'd anticipate if civilization wasn't ascending, but recuperating. This generates an archaeological contradiction that textbooks seldom confront. If these sites symbolize the gradual emergence of civilization, why do the earliest strata often exhibit the highest refinement? Why does intricacy sometimes decline over time before rising again? The response might rest in what divides the strata. Flood deposits at Kish, Shuruppak, and Nineveh throughout southern Mesopotamia. Digs have uncovered the same stratigraphic mark: cultural strata, flood sediment, cultural strata. The pattern surfaces too regularly to be chance, and the flood layers date to approximately the same era, around 5000 BC. But below those flood deposits lie the items that don't align, the ones implying organized society predating the deluge by thousands of years. What this suggests is extreme, but increasingly tough to reject. The cities we study as civilization's cradle may actually be restoration endeavors, efforts to reconstruct what was lost. The wisdom safeguarded in these communities, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, may not have been uncovered there. It may have been recalled there. The most revealing proof comes from the myths themselves. Sumerian writings describe civilization as a present delivered post-flood by the Apkallu, 7 sages who conveyed knowledge of construction, script, and rulership to humanity. Egyptian accounts speak of the first time, a golden era before the dynasties, when gods walked with men and instructed them in order. These aren't offered as figures of speech. They're noted as history. And if the earliest cities were erected over older bases intentionally, if their spots were selected not for practical motives, but because they were already meaningful, then what we call civilization's dawn might be something entirely different. A recalling, a comeback, a reconstruction on terrain that had been holy long before history started documenting itself. If civilization really started 6,000 years ago, Why do its oldest cities already rest atop something more ancient? Sometimes the stones themselves provide the proof, not the etchings carved into them, not the edifices they compose, but the manner they were shaped, transported, and positioned. Techniques that shouldn't be present in the eras they're attributed to. At Uruk's base, below the ziggurat devoted to the sky god Anu, excavators uncovered something that quietly disturbed them. The lowest platform stones were shaped with precise joints, edges joining so closely that a blade couldn't slide between them. The upper strata, constructed centuries later by civilizations with metal implements and written math, displayed rougher craftsmanship, broader spaces, coarser surfaces, less exact angles. The foundation surpassed the ability of everything erected upon it. This pattern surfaces across the ancient world. At Troy, Heinrich Schliemann's digs in the 1870s revealed 9 distinct city strata, each erected atop the remnants of the previous. But the megalithic walls at Troy's deepest levels, massive limestone blocks weighing several tons, displayed cutting methods not seen again until Troy VI built 3,000 years later. The intermediate strata used smaller stones, simpler building. The wisdom had been misplaced, then gradually relearned. What makes this archaeologically troubling is the implication. Whoever constructed the bases held skills that their offspring forgot. The advancement wasn't from simple to intricate. It was from intricate to simple to intricate again. And nowhere is this inversion more severe than in southeastern Turkey's hills. Göbekli Tepe's pillars weren't crafted by people testing stone. They were made by people who had already perfected it. Each T-shaped megalith was sculpted from bedrock quarries 200 meters from the building site. The biggest pillar weighs 20 tons. Moving it would demand synchronized effort from hundreds of individuals. Yet this happened 11,600 years ago, when human society allegedly comprised small wandering groups. But the logistics of transporting the stones is merely part of the enigma. The pillars were etched with reliefs so intricate that archaeologists can recognize specific animal types: foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boar. The artistry isn't basic or trial-based. It's assured, intentional, the work of experts who had done this previously. On Pillar 43, called the Vulture Stone, researchers spotted what seems to be a celestial map. The animals etched into the stone match constellations. At the top, a scorpion and a vulture align with Scorpius and Sagittarius positions. Below them, a headless form might depict Ophiuchus. If correct, this isn't arbitrary adornment. It's astronomical tracking encoded in stone at a time when humans weren't supposed to monitor heavenly patterns. Then there's the layout itself. The stone rings at Göbekli Tepe aren't positioned haphazardly. They align with solstices. The central pillars orient to specific cardinal points. Whoever planned this grasped geometry, seasonal rhythms, and star movements. This demands more than instinct. It requires generations of gathered wisdom handed down and honed. It requires instruction, documentation, continuity. Yet all this occurred before farming, before lasting settlements, before script. The conventional explanation that Göbekli Tepe signifies a short burst of hunter-gatherer intricacy doesn't explain the accuracy. Constructing one megalith ring might be remarkable. Building over 20 rings across 1,500 years, each upholding the same architectural rules, implies something much more structured. It implies tradition, institution, a society that understood what it was erecting and why. Here's the detail that alters everything. Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried around 8000 BC. The whole complex was packed with rubble and earth. Not demolished, not forsaken, entombed. The pillars were meticulously covered, keeping them whole beneath the ground for 10,000 years. Why would a society devote decades, possibly centuries, to building a monumental complex only to enter it? The standard theory is that burial was a ritual sealing, a method to consecrate the site. But this presumes burying sacred structures was common. It wasn't. Across the ancient world, temples were reconstructed, enlarged, reused, but seldom deliberately obscured unless the burial wasn't a conclusion, unless it was safeguarding. Because if the builders of Göbekli knew catastrophic shift was approaching, environmental breakdown, social turmoil, flooding, then entombment might be the sole way to shield what they'd made, to designate the terrain as holy, to guarantee that if anyone came back, they would know where to excavate. This reshapes all we thought we grasped about civilization's sequence. Complex architecture didn't arise from farming. Farming may have arisen because complex architecture was already there. Consider it. If monumental sacred sites like Göbekli attracted people from wide areas, if they needed coordinated seasonal assemblies to build and sustain, then those assemblies would generate pressure to remain longer, to nourish more individuals, to create excess. Religion didn't succeed settlement. Settlement succeeded religion. The ramifications extend outward. If large-scale social coordination existed prior to farming, then the whole model of civilization's growth crumbles. Humans didn't gradually stumble into intricacy. They held it earlier than we can account for and lost it multiple times. The stones recall what the texts don't. They reveal that history regressed before advancing, that wisdom was forgotten, then laboriously rebuilt, that the bases under our feet were placed by people whose abilities outstripped those who followed. If complex architecture preceded farming, then who erected it? And why? The Sumerians never asserted they invented kingship. This is simple to overlook when reading their texts, because we presume all human institutions were made by humans. But Sumerian scribes were precise with words. They didn't record that kingship was made, or uncovered, or founded. They recorded that it descended. The difference is important. When something descends, it arrives from above, from outside, from some place that already is. The Sumerian king list begins with a phrase that modern renderings often milden, but the original cuneiform is direct. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not after people learned self-governance, not after leaders arose, after kingship as a finished system fully shaped came down from elsewhere. This isn't figurative speech. It's a factual declaration within the document's logic. The scribes are noting a handover, not an origin. They're logging where authority shifted, not where it started. And this poses a question historians rarely confront. If the Sumerians didn't think they invented kingship, then what did they believe they inherited? The response might rest in who they said got it first. The king list identifies the earliest ruler as Alulim of Eridu. His rule 28,800 years. The second king, Al-Algar, governed for 36,000 years. The figures proceed in the same implausible span through 8 kings over 5 cities, summing 241 years before the flood. Modern experts dismiss these numbers as legendary overstatement, but the scribes who noted them used the same exact administrative style they applied to grain stocks and temple ledgers. They weren't composing verse. They were keeping records. And the math they employed uncovers something disturbing. Every reign duration is an exact multiple of the Sumerian sar, a unit equaling 3,600 years. Alulim's reign matches 8 sar. Al-Algar equals 10 sar. This isn't arbitrary exaggeration. It's methodical computation. The numbers adhere to a pattern rooted in their top unit of extended time measurement. Someone was tallying something. Whether years, cycles, or periods, the accuracy implies purpose. But here's what renders the document archaeologically unavoidable. After the flood, the list proceeds without stylistic shift. The same scribe with the same structure notes the new dynasties, and abruptly the reign lengths turn credible, a few hundred years, then under a century, then realistic human durations. And many of these later kings are verified by other sources. Gilgamesh shows on the list with a reign of 126 years. Remarkable, but not impossible. His city of Uruk has been dug up. His name appears on various tablets. The epic linked to him is among literature's oldest works. The king list handles him just as it does Alulim. Same documentary approach, same factual tone. No sign that one is legendary and the other historical. This compels an uneasy question. If the post-flood part is accepted as valid historical log, on what grounds do we discard the pre-flood part? The document itself draws no line. The scribe who penned it evidently believed both sections equally factual. Either the whole list is myth, or all of it is record. And if it's record, then what is it logging? Here's the detail most translations hide. The king list doesn't merely track rulers. It tracks the relocation of kingship itself as an entity, apart from the people who wielded it. When Eridu's dynasty concludes, the text states, "Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tabira." Not a new king ascended in Bad Tabira. The kingship as a distinct entity was taken there, shifted, moved. This occurs repeatedly in the pre-flood section. Kingship transfers from city to city, like an item being transported. The wording implies that whoever possessed it didn't make it or possess it outright. They were merely its temporary guardians. Later Mesopotamian kings grasped this. For 3,000 years after the king list was written, rulers kept claiming their authority descended from heaven. It wasn't metaphor. It was legal validity. To govern without this godly sanction was to be an impostor, not a king. But sanction from where? The list never clarifies. It presumes the reader already understands. Just as it presumes the reader comprehends what occurred before kingship descended. Why there was an era when humanity existed without structured rule, and what altered to make rule essential. The document is logging a shift, not a start. It's depicting the instant when something that existed elsewhere reached Earth and was allocated among cities. What's most alarming is what the list leaves out. It never details how the first king obtained authority. It never explains who instructed him in governance, or what merits made him suitable. Alulim simply emerges in Eridu, already holding kingship that had already descended. He didn't gain it. He didn't make it. He inherited it. From whom? The king list provides one clue. In the pre-flood section, several kings bear titles that appear nowhere else in Sumerian records. They're termed En and Lugal, words signifying lord and great man. But these words are linked with names that aren't Sumerian in source. They don't adhere to Sumerian linguistic forms. They sound more ancient, alien, as if the kings themselves arrived from elsewhere or were named by others. And if kingship was delivered to humanity from outside, then the implausible reign lengths might not be overstatements at all. They might be measures of something besides individual human lives, dynasties, eras, the duration of an institution passing through various hands. Or they might be literal. If power wasn't created by humans, then who or what was it handed down from? The Sumerian gods didn't create the world. This is the primary thing that distinguishes them from nearly every other pantheon in ancient faith. Read the Egyptian myths, and you discover atom forming the universe from primeval disorder. Read the Hebrew Bible, and God speaks existence into reality. Read the Greek cosmogonies, and divine lineages emerge from emptiness. But read Sumerian texts, and you find something odder. The gods arrive in a world that already is. They arrange it. They partition it. They oversee it. They never assert to have formed it. The oldest Sumerian cosmology, the Eridu Genesis, starts not with creation, but with allocation. The great gods, An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag, are already there when the story begins. Their first noted action isn't to form land or sky. It's to assign duties, and An takes the heavens. Enlil gets the atmosphere and earth. Enki is assigned the waters. Ninhursag handles birth and fertility. The text depicts this with the accuracy of a business reorganization. Each god gets a realm, a jurisdiction, not as prize or legacy, but as task. Someone or something had already split the world into managerial zones before they came. The gods are assigned roles, not a claim. And the language describing their actions mirrors this. When Enki arranges the freshwater streams, the Sumerian verb is mi, meaning to decree or set norms. He doesn't form water. He establishes the guidelines ruling its behavior. He institutes order where disarray was. Enlil's role is even more revealing. His title, Lord of the Command, refers not to creative might, but executive power. He issues orders. He upholds boundaries. He sustains division between domains. When humans irritate him, he doesn't annihilate them. He modifies their settings, shortens their lifespan, restricts their breeding, alters their functional limits. He oversees them. The Atrahasis epic, one of Mesopotamia's oldest flood stories, shows how businesslike this bond was. The text opens with younger gods grumbling about work. They've been excavating channels, sustaining irrigation, laboring without pause for, the text notes, 40 years. They strike. The elder gods assemble not to penalize the revolt, but to fix the workforce deficit. Enki suggests forming humans expressly to assume the labor. The goddess Nintu shapes humanity from clay blended with divine blood, and the new laborers are promptly employed. Humans aren't crafted in divine likeness as cherished offspring. They're produced as staff. The text is clear. Humanity exists to ease the gods of manual toil. And here's what most translations conceal. The gods don't instruct humans in farming or building. They allot these duties. The wisdom isn't imparted as present. It's dispersed as vocational training. The instructions of Shurupak, one of the world's oldest wisdom writings, holds counsel from a father to his son. But the context is unusual. The father, Shurupak, asserts he's conveying instructions originally given to him when the gods set the rules. Not when the gods formed the world, when they set the rules. This difference surfaces throughout Sumerian writings. The gods don't describe how things originated. They describe how things are structured. Their authority derives not from creation, but from placement within an existing order. Even the temples mirror this. The ziggurat wasn't a tribute to divine creative force. It was a managerial hub. The Sumerian word for temple, literally means house, the abode where a god handled affairs. Temple records hold thousands of tablets logging grain distributions, work assignments, and resource apportionment. The priests weren't conducting worship rites. They were handling divine administration. Here's the detail that reshapes everything in Sumerian theology. Even the gods respond to something superior. The idea of me, divine decrees governing reality, exists apart from the gods themselves. These me are depicted as tangible items that can be pilfered, transferred, or misplaced, In the myth Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna intoxicates Enki and steals the me from him, carrying them to her city. The decrees controlling civilization aren't produced by divine intent. They're artifacts, things existing objectively, separate from whoever holds them. Which poses an disturbing question. If the gods don't generate the me and the me rule how reality operates, then who set the me initially? The texts never state. They presume it's already known. What makes this theologically odd is how it differs from later religions. By the era Greek and Roman myths were organized, gods had become creators, artists, lovers, figures with desires and creative drives. The Hebrew and Christian God clearly creates ex nihilo, from nothing. But the Sumerian gods administered a system they received. They managed areas they were allotted. They enforced rules they didn't compose. They acted less like deities and more like district overseers reporting to an authority the texts never identify. And humanity's role in this setup was equally evident. Not children to nurture, not souls to redeem, workers to direct. The bond was contractual, not familial. Humans supplied labor and tributes. God sustained order and safeguard. It was a pact, a deal, an economy of duty that bound both parties. This reshapes all we think we grasp about ancient faith. The Sumerians weren't envisioning omnipotent beings shaping reality by caprice. They were depicting something that resembled middle management remarkably. Why would a civilization envision its gods not as creators, but as overseers? The oldest Sumerian texts don't clarify where anything originated. Not the earth, not the sky, not humanity, not the gods themselves. They commence as if everything is already underway, already structured, already operating per rules set before the story begins. This lack is easy to overlook because we expect ancient societies to be fixated on origins. Every civilization we examine has creation tales, myths explaining how the world started, how humans were shaped, how order arose from chaos, except the Sumerians. Their earliest religious writings, hymns, prayers, administrative logs dating to 2700 BC function on the presumption that the reader already knows how things commenced. They never clarify it. They merely describe what's occurring now in an ongoing present that appears to have no recall of its own start. The Eridu Genesis, written around 1600 BC, is often termed Sumer's creation myth. But read it attentively, and you'll see it doesn't actually depict creation. It opens with the assertion after An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had formed the black-headed people. The formation of humanity is noted as something already done. The text doesn't describe how it happened. It's a nod to an earlier incident that the audience is presumed to already comprehend, but no earlier text survives explaining it. The same pattern shows in the debate between bird and fish, one of the oldest extant Sumerian literary works. It begins in those distant days when the fates were determined. The fates are already set. The world is already ordered. The poem continues from that point, without ever returning to clarify when or how the determining occurred. Compare this to later Mesopotamian literature, and the contrast grows sharp. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, composed around 1200 BC, 500 years after the earliest Sumerian texts, is a true creation epic. It depicts primordial waters, divine battle, the cleaving of Tiamat's body to shape heaven and earth, the formation of humans from divine blood. It's exactly the sort of origin narrative the Sumerians never penned. Why? The standard scholarly explanation is that Sumerian creation myths were real but lost. But this presumes absence means mishap, and the absence here is too uniform to be mishap. The Sumerians were thorough record keepers. They logged grain yields, temple stocks, legal quarrels, astronomical sightings, medical methods. Thousands of tablets endure covering every facet of daily life and religious observance. Yet none describe how the world commenced. Here's what makes this archaeologically meaningful. The texts don't handle origins as mysterious or sacred secrets too holy to inscribe. They handle them as unimportant, not worth debating, already resolved. The Sumerian temple hymns list 42 temples across various cities, describing the gods dwelling in them and the rites performed there. Each hymn presumes the temple has always been in some form. There's no reference to who erected the first temple, when divine veneration started, or how humans learned to perform rituals. These institutions are shown as timeless. And when Sumerian literature does allude to the past, it uses a specific phrase translating roughly as in distant days or in former times. But the phrase doesn't signify at the beginning. It signifies long ago within an already present structure. There's no Sumerian term for absolute start. No match for Genesis's in the beginning or the Greek arche. Their language holds ideas for continuation, inheritance, and transfer, but not for origin from void. This implies something deep about how they viewed time itself. Most cultures envision history as linear, a start point, a progression, an end. The Sumerians appear to see it as cyclical or perpetual, an eternal process they joined midway. They logged their specific chapter without asserting it was the initial chapter. The lament for Sumer and Ur, penned after destruction around 2000 BC, grieves the collapse of cities and the uprooting of people. But even in disaster, the text doesn't portray this as the world's end. It's presented as one calamity among many that had preceded and would follow. Civilization ascends. Civilization descends. The cycle persists. No one presumes they're seeing the original ascent or the ultimate descent. Here's the detail that reshapes everything. When the Babylonians overtook Sumer and started penning their own creation myths, they weren't plugging a knowledge gap. They were claiming political power. The Enuma Elish sets Marduk as supreme creator god, a role he didn't have in earlier Sumerian theology, by crediting him with world-making. Babylonian priests raised their patron deity above the older Sumerian pantheon. Creation myths became instruments of validity. But the Sumerians themselves never required this instrument. They didn't assert their gods made everything, because creation wasn't authority's basis. Management was, administration of an existing order. This suggests they believed they received their civilization rather than devised it. And if they received it, then from whom? The texts don't state, but they safeguard something stranger than an answer. A total lack of interest in the question, as if the origin was either unknowable, irrelevant, or most alarming, already grasped in ways the text didn't need to log because everyone already knew. What endures isn't an explanation of starts. It's documentation of a continuation. A society sustaining systems handed down from a prior era they never asserted to have seen. They logged laws they didn't compose, sustained temples they didn't first erect, followed rites whose origins they never clarified. And they did this with accuracy and diligence, as if their role wasn't to form civilization, but to safeguard it. What sort of culture logs everything except its own start? Myths recall things history doesn't. Not metaphors, not symbols, actual data, geographic positions, astronomical placements, measures of time and distance that can be verified against geological logs and confirmed as precise. This is what separates myth from fiction. Fiction creates freely. Myth safeguards obsessively, even when it no longer grasps what it's safeguarding. The Epic of Gilgamesh holds a flood account narrated by Utnapishtim, the only human survivor. The story includes exact building details for the vessel he constructed. A cube-shaped craft, 7 decks tall, coated with bitumen inside and out. The dimensions given, roughly 60 x 60 x 60 meters, describe a structure built for steadiness, not voyage. A floating holder meant to endure turbulence, not steer to a goal. These aren't fantasy elements, they're engineering specs. The text depicts Utnapishtim loading the seed of all living things onto the craft. Not just creatures, but artisans, their implements and provisions. When the flood arrives, the depiction turns eerily technical. The gods were terrified by the deluge and withdrew, ascending to Anu's heaven. The wording shifts. This isn't divine penalty calmly delivered. It's divine fear. The gods themselves escape to the highest heaven and cower like dogs huddled against to the outer wall. They didn't trigger this. They're frightened of it. After 7 days, the waters subside, and Utnapishtim's vessel grounds on Mount Nisir. He dispatches birds in order, a dove, a swallow, a raven to check if land has surfaced. The dove and swallow come back. The raven doesn't. Standard flood endurance procedure. Every element suggests someone narrating a real incident, not crafting allegory. Now contrast this with stories from cultures without Mesopotamian contact. In Hindu lore, Manu is alerted to a coming flood by a fish that grows immense. Manu builds a ship, survives the deluge, and later receives 7 sages who aid him in re-establishing order and law. The framework is almost the same. Divine alert, building, catastrophe, survival, renewal via inherited wisdom. In Greek myth, Deucalion and Pyrrha are warned by Prometheus. They construct a chest, endure 9 days and nights of rain, land on Mount Parnassus, and repopulate the world by hurling stones that turn into people. Again, warning, vessel, flood, landing on high ground, restart. Andean traditions describe Viracocha arising from Lake Titicaca after a great flood demolished the prior world. Chinese mythology keeps Gun and Yu combating catastrophic floods. Hawaiian legend remembers Nu'u enduring world-destroying waters in a craft with his kin. The pattern repeats over every populated continent. Not vague likenesses, but structural accuracy. A small group alerted ahead, survival via preparation, landing on elevated terrain, transmission of wisdom to reconstruct. If these were separate inventions, we'd anticipate variation in the core order. But the order stays constant. Even the survivor count is often identical, 7 to 8 people or families. This uniformity has bothered anthropologists for over a century. The standard explanation that all cultures face flooding and thus mythologize it doesn't explain the detail. Local floods don't need 7 days of rain, mountain landings, and bird dispatches to test for dry land. But a single globally felt catastrophe would. And here's what geology verifies. At the last ice age's end, roughly 11,700 years ago, sea levels surged catastrophically. Not slowly, but in bursts as ice dams broke and glacial lakes drained. The Younger Dryas period concluded with rapid warming, melting ice sheets covering 1/3 of the planet. Low coastal areas where most human groups would have resided were flooded within generations. Whole landscapes submerged. River mouths changed. Familiar skylines vanished underwater. For those experiencing this, it would have felt exactly as myths describe, a world-ending flood. But here's the detail that alters everything. Australian Aboriginal spoken traditions have been confirmed to safeguard real events over 10,000 years. linguists examining coastal Aboriginal tales identified geographic elements, specific bays, islands, and land bridges absent above water since the last ice age. When researchers matched these legendary terrains to bathymetric maps, they aligned. The tales were safeguarding actual pre-flood geography transmitted through 300 to 400 generations. Myths aren't failing to recall history. They're succeeding at it under impossible terms, safeguarding data across spans exceeding written records by millennia. This reshapes what mythology is. Not primitive efforts to explain nature, but archives, data vaults for cultures without script, the repetition, the formulaic framework, the exact elements. These aren't artistic selections. They're mnemonic tools ensuring precise conveyance. And if flood myths safeguard real incidents, what else might myths encode? Sumerian texts depict the Abzu, the freshwater sea below the earth where Enki resides. For centuries, this was seen as pure imagination. Then geologists uncovered vast underground aquifers under Mesopotamia. Freshwater stores separated from surface water exactly as described. The Vedic Sarasvati River, long deemed legendary, has been verified via satellite images and archaeological surveys. The river was real, supported major communities, then vanished around 1900 BC, exactly when texts say it disappeared. Greek myths located the Minoan civilization on Crete and depicted its ruin by quake and wave. Rejected as legend until 1900 AD excavations revealed the palace at Knossos, proving the civilization was real and indeed ruined by seismic disaster. Myth after myth, when checked against proof, proves to hold truth embedded in story, which means the stranger parts, the impossibly long-lived kings, the gods descending from heaven. The golden ages before recorded history might also encode something real. Not literal, perhaps, but safeguarding data about eras, social frameworks, or incidents no other record seized. The flood stories specifically safeguard a pattern suggesting coordinated reaction, advance alert, deliberate readiness, preservation of wisdom and skills. This isn't chance survival, it's structured continuity. Someone knew the catastrophe approached. Someone safeguarded the wisdom needed to reconstruct. Someone ensured that when waters receded, civilization could restart instead of begin from void. The myths don't term this fortune. They term it divine intervention. But intervention by whom? And if these tales safeguard memory of a pre-flood civilization advanced enough to foresee disaster and organize survival, then everything following, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, might be exactly what myths assert they are. Restorations of something older, not civilization's birth, but its recuperation. What if myths are not metaphors, but echoes of incidents too ancient to recall directly? The same frameworks surface in civilizations that never encountered each other. Not similar frameworks, identical ones, administrative orders, legal rules, temple economies, astronomical schedules, irrigation oversight systems. They emerge fully shaped in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley within a few hundred years around 3300 BC, with no evident growth stages. This simultaneity has troubled historians since the 19th century. The standard explanation is convergent evolution. Similar environmental stresses yielding similar answers, but convergence yields variations. It doesn't yield identical plans. Yet when you scrutinize early law rules, the principles are eerily uniform. The Code of Ur-Nammu, penned around 2100 BC in Sumer, sets legal ideas that appear almost at once in Egyptian and later Babylonian law: property rights, contract upholding, injury compensation, hierarchical punishments based on social rank. These aren't instinctive findings. They're refined legal structures requiring generations to polish. But they surface without polish, without earlier rougher versions. The same pattern applies to writing. Cuneiform arises in Sumer around 3200 BC. Egyptian hieroglyphs surface around 3100 BC. Indus Valley script appears around 3300 BC. All three systems are already intricate when they first show in the archaeological record, able to log abstract ideas, legal deals, and administrative info. There are no rehearsal texts, no transitional shapes, no proof of people slowly devising symbolic depiction. The writing systems just commence. And they commence by logging data that presumes the institutions they're documenting already exist. Temple records, tax logs, royal orders. The very first written texts aren't experimental. They're bureaucratic. They're sustaining systems already active, which means the systems predate the writing. But if these civilizations didn't devise their own organizational frameworks, where did the frameworks come from? Look at how governance shifts between cultures. When the Akkadian Empire overtook Sumer around 2300 BC, they didn't enforce a new system. They embraced the existing one entirely. Akkadian rulers adopted Sumerian titles, sustained Sumerian temples, preserved Sumerian administrative methods. They altered the language but retained the framework. The same occurs in Egypt when the Old Kingdom fell around 2200 BC, and regional governors grabbed power during the first intermediate period. They didn't form new governance types. They duplicated the pharaonic system on a smaller level. Each governor presented himself as a miniature pharaoh upholding the same hierarchical model. The framework endures the collapse. It duplicates itself. This implies something deep. These organizational setups weren't devised by any single culture. They were received by all of them. And here's where the archaeology turns alarming. Recent digs at Harappa in the Indus Valley uncovered city planning mirroring Mesopotamian urban design rules, grid arrangements, standardized brick dimensions, sophisticated drainage, central silos. The two civilizations were divided by 2,000 kilometers of desert and mountain, with no proof of trade or contact in their foundational eras. Yet they erected the same city types. The standard sizes for bricks in the Indus Valley, a 4:1 ratio, match proportional systems in Mesopotamian building. This isn't chance. It's applied math. Someone computed these ratios deliberately, and both civilizations employ them. But neither shows proof of developing the math from nothing. The ratios surface in their earliest structures already uniform. As if they were instructed, the same accuracy appears in astronomical wisdom. The Sumerian calendar split the year into 12 lunar months, with occasional tweaks to sync with solar years. The Egyptian calendar used the identical structure. Indus Valley seals display zodiacal icons arranged in sequences matching Mesopotamian star lists. These aren't separate sky observations. These are coordinated systems tracking celestial mechanics with mathematical accuracy, requiring generations of built-up sighting. Yet all three civilizations hold this wisdom at their founding, not after centuries of polish. Immediately. Here's the detail that shatters the narrative. When archaeologists dig the earliest strata of these civilizations, they don't find signs of trial and error. They find skill. The first cities aren't chaotic trials in urban existence. They're designed. The first temples aren't rough structures. They're architecturally refined. The first legal codes aren't basic customs. They're thorough frameworks. Everything begins intricate and remains intricate. This is the reverse of what evolutionary models forecast. Technologies grow through stages. Rough prototypes, better versions, eventual mastery. But core civilizational frameworks, governance, law, writing, astronomy skip the growth phase completely. They arrive finished, which suggests they were conveyed, not devised, but conveyed from where? The answer might rest in what all these early civilizations recall. Not just flood myths, but specific figures who brought wisdom. Sumerian texts depict the Apkallu, wise entities who taught humanity civilization's arts before the flood. Egyptian tradition honors Thoth, who gave humanity script, math, and sacred wisdom. Hindu texts remember the 7 sages who safeguarded knowledge through disaster. These aren't gods. The texts distinguish them clearly. They're described as instructors, preservers, bearers of data from an earlier era. And every tradition notes they arrived after a great calamity, after ruin. After the world had already ended once, they didn't form civilization. They restored it. This reshapes all we grasp about the Bronze Age. These weren't naive cultures stumbling toward intricacy. They were inheritor cultures applying a system they'd gotten from survivors of something older. The frameworks weren't devised in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley. They were duplicated there. The wisdom wasn't uncovered. It was safeguarded. And if these foundational civilizations were themselves reconstructing from received templates, then the true origin point, the first civilization, lies further back, deeper below the flood strata and the buried bases. Somewhere in the undocumented past, someone planned these systems initially. Someone set the frameworks that every later civilization would copy. If every early culture receives the same frameworks, who built them first? Civilizations don't vanish neatly. They leave remnants, pottery fragments, building bases, burial locations, tool pieces. Even cultures collapsing violently leave signs of their presence scattered over landscapes. Archaeology rests on this principle. Human trace is permanent, except when it isn't. Between 11,700 and 9,600 years ago, there's an archaeological void in the record. Not total absence. We find dispersed communities, stone implements, burial sites, but a notable lack of the organizational intricacy that comes before and after this span. Before this void, Göbekli Tepe and like megalithic sites display refined planning. After this void, the sudden rise of agriculture, settled hamlets, and swift progress towards civilization. During the void, quiet. The standard VEW is that this marks a transitional era. Humans slowly mastering farming, gradually settling, testing social structure. But the timeline doesn't back slow shift. The changes occur quickly, almost at once, across various regions, as if people weren't uncovering these practices, but recalling them. And the void itself aligns exactly with the most catastrophic climate incident in recent geological history. The Younger Dryas period started around 12,900 years ago, with an abrupt return to Ice Age states. Global temperatures fell by 7 degrees Celsius within decades. Ice sheets that had retreated grew again. Areas supporting human groups became unlivable. Then around 11,700 years ago, it ended just as suddenly. The climate didn't warm slowly. It jumped back to interglacial states within one human lifetime. Ice sheets fell. Meltwater poured into seas. Sea levels climbed over 100 meters in under a millennium. For coastal groups, the majority, this was apocalyptic. The Persian Gulf was arid land in the Ice Age. So was the Mediterranean basin near Cyprus, the Sunda Shelf linking Southeast Asian islands, India's coastlines, the Gulf of Cambay. These were vast fertile plains with streams, fresh water, and mild climates, all drowned. If an advanced civilization was present in the late Ice Age, it would have naturally grown along these now immersed coastlines. And when the melt sped up, these groups would have faced a decision: retreat inland or die. Most would have retreated, but retreat means forsaking. Everything built on the coasts, cities, temples, ports, infrastructure would have been abandoned as waters climbed. And here's what makes this archaeologically ruinous. Water obliterates. Structures underwater for 11,000 years don't endure whole. Wood decays, mud brick melts, organic matter breaks down. Even stone exposed to tidal wear and sediment burial turns unrecognizable as crafted material. What might have been a harbor turns into a geological shape. What might have been a square becomes a seafloor oddity dismissed as natural. We're not seeking these sites because we presume they don't exist. And we presume they don't exist because we're not seeking. The few underwater maps done have already found oddities: the structures off Dwarka, the Yonaguni steppes, the Gulf of Cambay shapes. But each find is rationalized individually: natural wear, coincidental geology, local quirks. No one charts them as part of a pattern because acknowledging the pattern would demand acknowledging its implications. But even if coastal cities drowned, what about inland communities? If a refined culture was real, why haven't we uncovered their core sites? Here's the detail that shifts the search criteria. Modern cities are erected on the same spots as ancient ones. Jerusalem rests atop Bronze Age communities, which rest atop Neolithic habitation strata, which rest atop even earlier remnants. Damascus, Athens, Varanasi, every ancient city is layered. People build where people always built, because certain spots offer strategic edges that don't alter over millennia. If a pre-flood civilization picked optimal spots for communities, those same spots would have been reoccupied post-waters. The earliest visible strata would be Neolithic, the reconstructing phase, but below them might lie proof of what preceded. Except no one probes that deep. Once excavators hit what they deem bedrock civilization, the Neolithic base, they halt. The presumption is that nothing meaningful lies beneath. But what if everything meaningful lies beneath? The deepest digs ever done, like those at Eridu, do uncover unexplained refinement in their lowest strata. But these oddities are explained as advanced for their era, not as proof of an earlier culture. The framework doesn't permit an earlier culture, so the proof is reinterpreted to fit. This creates a methodological snare. We don't uncover what we don't seek, and we don't seek what we don't anticipate uncovering. And there's another issue. If catastrophe scattered survivors, splintering them into isolated clusters, then cultural memory would degrade fast. Within 3 generations, detailed wisdom becomes legend. Within 10, legend becomes myth. Within 50, myth becomes symbolic tale detached from historical fact. The survivors reaching Mesopotamia might have safeguarded knowledge, irrigation, astronomy, legal ideas, but lost the context. They recalled what to do, but forgot who taught them. The knowledge endured, the teachers didn't. This would explain why early civilizations hold advanced frameworks without origin tales. They received a system whose creators had been forgotten. And if the builders were forgotten, their cities misidentified and their coastal hubs drowned, then the only proof of their presence would be indirect: the knowledge systems they conveyed, the myths depicting their ruin, and the archaeological oddities we keep rationalizing. The lack of direct proof isn't proof of lack. It might be proof of erasure, geological, cultural, and methodological. Because here's what we know occurred 11,700 years ago. The world's coastlines vanished. Whole landscapes submerged. Climate destabilized. Population shifted. And when stability returned, humans abruptly held agricultural wisdom, architectural rules, astronomical grasp, and organizational systems with no clear origin point. The void in the record isn't vacant. It's hidden by water, by time, by the presumption that what we haven't uncovered doesn't exist. If a civilization vanished completely, would we even identify its remnants? We still employ their calendar. Not figuratively, literally. The 7-day week lacks astronomical foundation. It doesn't sync with lunar phases or solar rhythms. It's arbitrary, except it isn't. It's Sumerian, based on their sacred number 7, embedded in Babylonian astronomy, adopted by Judaism, received by Christianity and Islam, and now followed worldwide as if it were natural rule. We didn't select this framework. We received it. And we never query where it originated, because it was already there when our civilization started logging itself. The same reception governs legal systems. Modern contract law descends straight from Roman jurisprudence, which pulled from Greek civic rules, which borrowed from Babylonian principles, which honed Sumerian precedents. The idea that pacts are binding, that harm demands recompense, that social order sets penalty. These aren't human instincts. They're taught structures, rules someone set, and everyone else embraced. Look at how authority validates itself. Modern governments claim mandate via constitutions, elections, or divine right, but the core presumption stays the same as the Sumerian king list. Authority must descend from a higher origin. It must be granted, shifted, received. No modern state asserts its government was devised from void. Every system traces validity backward through prior systems, forming chains of succession spanning centuries. The framework duplicates itself over time, safeguarding its shape even as content alters. We call this tradition, but tradition is just another term for upkeep. We're upholding something we didn't erect. And here's what makes this psychologically alarming. We don't know who erected it first. The earliest law rules don't say we formed these principles. They say these are the principles. The oldest calendars don't clarify why time is split this way. They presume you already understand. The foundational texts of governance, math, and astronomy present themselves as logs of existing systems, not invention of new ones. Which means the origin point, the actual instant when these structures were planned, lies before recorded history, before script, before the civilizations we examine. Somewhere in the undocumented past, someone made choices that still rule how we organize reality. They chose to split time into units. They set hierarchical authority. They codified exchange, property, and duty into systems we now treat as universal. But they weren't universal. They were choices made by people whose names we don't know in a civilization we don't recognize for reasons we can't rebuild. And we've been existing inside those choices ever since. This reshapes what civilization is. Not a series of innovations building toward advancement, but a repeating pattern of reconstructing from received templates. The Bronze Age civilizations reconstructed from wisdom, safeguarded through catastrophe. The classical world reconstructed from Bronze Age pieces. The medieval era reconstructed from classical ruins. The modern period reconstructed from all that preceded. Each cycle believes itself original. Each age thinks it's devising new answers. But examine closely, and you find older precedents, older frameworks, older presumptions that never get queried because they're so basic, they've become unseen. We're not forming civilization. We're upholding it, repairing it, expanding within its current parameters. The question is whose parameters? Because if the structures we work within, were planned before history started, and if those structures were refined enough to endure multiple civilizational falls, then whoever made them grasped social organization at a level we still haven't exceeded. We've added technology. We've grown scale. But the core frameworks, how we validate authority, divide work, log transactions, measure time, enforce order, remain basically unchanged from models set in the Neolithic or earlier. This implies something deep about civilization's nature itself. It's not infinitely variable. There appear to be optimal setups, patterns that surface repeatedly because they function. But that poses a disturbing possibility. If only certain setups are stable, and if those setups were already uncovered in the deep past, then every civilization risen since has been rediscovering the same answers, not creating, remembering. And if we're remembering rather than devising, then the wisdom we hold might not be ours. It might be received from sources we can't trace, conveyed through transmission chains so long the origin has been forgotten. The Sumerians said kingship descended from heaven. Maybe they meant it literally. Or maybe heaven was their term for before. From an era so distant it seemed otherworldly. From the world that preceded the flood, before the catastrophe, before the reset. We don't know what that world resembled. We don't know how advanced it was or why it concluded. We don't know if it was one global civilization or a network of regional cultures sharing wisdom. But we know it left something behind. Not monuments that would decay. Not cities that would drown. Something more lasting. Systems, structures, organizational patterns encoded into the cultures that endured its fall. Those patterns remain with us. They're the scaffolding we erect our societies on. The invisible architecture shaping how we think authority should function, how time should be measured, how order should be upheld. We didn't plan this scaffolding. We found it already there, and we've been building within its limits for so long we've forgotten its present. The story we tell ourselves that civilization is 6,000 years old and started in Mesopotamia is comforting because it makes us modern. It places us at the summit of a steady ascent from primitive starts toward enlightened intricacy. But what if that story is incorrect? What if we're not at the summit but somewhere midway? What if the bases under our cities are older than we can gauge, and the wisdom we deem advanced is actually recovered? Then the question humanity has been posing shifts. It's not how do we erect civilization. That question presumes we're starting from void. The older question, the one the Sumerians were posing when they wrote that kingship descended from heaven, is more alarming. What was already here before us? And beneath that question lies another, one we may not be prepared to answer. If civilization ascended once before, reached sophistication, and fell so completely that we barely identify its remnants, what makes us sure it won't occur again? The bases under our feet were not placed by us. The systems we work within were not devised in our era. The wisdom we think we uncovered may simply be wisdom we recalled. And if we're existing inside an inheritance we don't fully grasp, then perhaps the wisest action we can take is to recall that others preceded us. They erected something. They lost it. And we've spent the last 6,000 years attempting to reconstruct it without realizing that's what we're doing. The world under our world remains there, buried, drowned, forgotten, but not obliterated, because we're still employing their calendar.